Welcome to the Brand Together podcast. Join host Brett Ryan to dive deep and go behind the scenes of successful brand partnerships. Featuring pros from every industry and vertical, from mega brands to startups and everything in between. The Brand Together podcast is essential listening for anyone interested in learning more about brand partnerships. Are you ready? Let's dive in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Brand Together podcast. I'm your host, Brett Ryan. I'm joined today by an old friend, Dr. Brandon Guthrie. Brandon's a director of international development for Dairy Queen, and he's got over 15 years of experience in international consumer retail, franchising, M&A, development, and finance. Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Good to be here.
I'm really excited to have you on. You have so much experience in restaurant franchising. I just knew I had to get you on here. And of course, your expertise expands in a couple directions outward beyond that. But from my perspective, a lot of the brands that we know and love, certainly here over in the West, I know a lot of your experience is in international markets, but in North America, which is my frame of reference, some of our most beloved brands are the McDonald's, the Wendy's, right? The Taco Bells of the world.
The Dairy Queens.
The Dairy Queens, of course, right? And so having you on the podcast to get your expert perspective on not only those brands, but also the partnership opportunities they undertake and how they might approach those opportunities is irresistible. So grateful that you're joining.
No, it's a good point. And I think people sometimes, it can go a little bit unnoticed how powerful some of these consumer F&B, food and beverage kind of franchise brands are. Because a lot of people look at them as restaurants. Oh, I'm going to a restaurant.
Yep.
And I think sometimes people underestimate or don't even realize how much the branding aspect and that connection with the consumer plays into their choices and how they're choosing restaurants. You mentioned McDonald's. McDonald's is obviously known throughout the world, but it's not great food.
Yeah.
Nobody would say McDonald's is great food, although like people actually probably will say it. But if you're actually rating the food, it's not great food.
Yep.
Sorry, McDonald's. But it is consistent.
Yep.
But they have an amazing brand.
Yep.
And it stands for consistency and affordability and American and all these different things that go along with the brand, and they have an emotional connection with the consumer. And so these really powerful F&B brands generally fit into that kind of category where they are a brand that produces food and that gives food to the consumer. But like people, I think, would be misplaced in thinking that they go to some of these restaurants all the time for the amazing tasting food. It's like they underestimate how much of an emotional connection has been created over time through various things. Experiences, etc. But yeah, it's definitely a brand.
You bring up a really interesting idea, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, of the incepting thought behind, say, for example, the Happy Meal, right? I'm sure my earliest brand experiences with McDonald's, right? I'm a little kid. I'm getting my Disney toy or whatever in the Happy Meal and some of that food. And you're right. No one's under the illusion that it's fine dining. If you're going to stack rank it, if you've got a hungry family of four and you've got discretionary budget, you're in a position where you're going out to eat, your kids aren't necessarily going to be pulling for the super high-end, right, steakhouse. They're going to be pulling for what they know and love.
What they've seen on TV.
What they've seen on
What's
TV.
Been marketed. What toys in the Happy Meal. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, that's interesting to me because I often wonder about, with fast food in general, let me just throw some spaghetti at you and you can tell me how right or wrong I am. But you're an expert in franchising, and I've always held this opinion. I'd like to think it's an educated opinion, but I'm going to just wave my white flag and say I'm a little bit inexperienced in this arena. But my perception is that a franchising brand really only has a handful of things that they need to offer their franchisees. One of them is a killer brand, like a strong, powerful brand. Number two is a serviceable product. Like you mentioned, doesn't have to be the best product in the world. It has to be serviceable. And then the third thing would be like a loose but fairly robust operating model. You get those three things. And my perception when it comes to these large fast food, even some of your fast casual shops, my perception is that the corporate responsibility to franchisees, a huge portion of that is the strength of the brand. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So let me repeat it back and dice it up a little bit.
Sure.
But essentially, I think you're on track. You mentioned one of them is basically a playbook, right? So why are you going to go franchise a brand or a concept versus opening up Brett's Burgers?
Yep.
One of the reasons is you get a playbook, you get an operating manual, you get guides on how to set things up. And along with that, you get a proven model, right? From an investor standpoint, you get a proven economic model.
Yeah.
Which is also why banks and investors, et cetera, are more willing to invest generally with franchise at different rates than with a standard start-alone business, because there's a track record of something that you're investing in. Specifically in the US, you're opening the 3,001st restaurant of a brand. Pretty good idea how it's going to go no matter where you open it.
Yep.
And then the third one and the last one, and definitely not the least one, is the brand. So for sure, a huge part of that is the brand. And what are you getting with that? You're getting consumer share of mind, right? So you're saying instead of opening up Brett's Burgers, I'm going to be opening up a Wendy's or a Dairy Queen or a McDonald's. And generally, the brand has traveled and already achieved some consumer share of mind with the consumer before it's even open. So you get access to somebody that's going to come through the door essentially day one, compared to having to go build that brand and build that reputation and build all those things from scratch.
Yeah.
And so that's really the motivate. If you can do all those things better than something that's already there, then you should be opening your own concept, right?
Sure.
And people do that. But that is the benefit of opening up the franchise. The interesting thing when you get into the international space, right, when you're taking a concept from a home market and transporting that or transplanting that into a new market from the US to Japan or to the Middle East or to Europe, the brand aspect actually diminishes a little bit.
Yeah.
Because that consumer share of mind, it depends on how strong the brand is, might not have traveled to as far as where you're going. And so you also have to take a different position of more of a brand builder sometimes. When you're commercializing these markets internationally. You have to go back to the same principles that existed when the brand was being built in the home market or in the US, which can be a challenge when brands are growing internationally. But yeah, to your original point, brand is really one of the biggest things. And as a brand owner or working for corporate, that's one of the main things that really you're in charge of.
Yeah.
You're a steward of the brand, because a lot of these concepts are almost 100% franchised now.
Yep.
Wall Street almost demands it a lot of times. And so what are you doing? You're focusing on the playbook, right? The standards, and making sure groups are in compliance. And you're focusing on the execution of the brand domestically and internationally. That's where you can add the most value. And if you get off track with the brand a little bit, really any dilution of the brand can cause some serious problems, because that's your model. That's where your value is. So if you lose that, you don't have much.
I'm thinking about what you just shared about brands that are strong domestically expanding internationally.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly in your experience, you've seen brands that have done this really well. And I'm sure you've seen brands that have done this really poorly. What distinguishes the good performers from the poor performers when you're trying to take a strong domestic brand to an international market?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things, and really what we're talking about here, is home market to an international market.
Yep.
For simplicity's sake, we'll say US. We'll assume US to international.
Sure.
There are definitely more that have struggled than have done it well. And as you think about it internationally, it's difficult. And there's a few reasons why that ends up being the case. Is sometimes your instincts work against you a little bit.
Yeah.
As brand owners, if you have a domestic brand that's starting to expand internationally, there's the old adage, and I don't know if you've seen this before, but it's what got you here won't get you there.
Yep.
And there's the picture of the young lady that's standing at the edge of the pier, looking at the island across like a river or an ocean. And I think that's, if you oversimplified, that's generally the pitfall that people run into when they're managing a brand and taking it overseas. Is they assume that what they did to grow the brand and be successful domestically is the recipe and the formula to do the same thing internationally. And that's not the case. In fact, in the majority of times, it's not the case.
You see it, and sometimes it's just so starkly different, right? The example I think of is like KFC, where KFC has a certain brand reputation. They have a certain brand in the US, and in Japan, it's like a big holiday food, right? People order KFC.
It's Christmas.
It is Christmas.
It is the Christmas food.
Yeah.
Fried chicken is what the Japanese consumer thinks that Americans eat during Christmas.
Yeah.
And that is due to marketing.
Yeah.
There was a marketing execution, a marketing program that basically said this is what Americans eat during Christmas. And now, as part of essentially Japanese tradition, you buy the holiday bucket of KFC for Christmas. And that's what and they do it because they think that's, or they thought, or they were told that's what Americans did. And now now that's not the way they do it now. They do it because it's part of the tradition, but that's how it was integrated into their tradition. Which is super, super interesting because obviously we don't do that. It's not fried chicken is the Christmas food.
It's interesting to me because to me, it says a little bit about how you might potentially approach strategy going from the US to some of these international markets. If it's an area of the world that takes cultural cues from America, which a lot of places do, perhaps that's something you can be cognizant of. But I have a question for you as an operator. To what extent do you believe, or do you perceive that these US brands trying to go international, to what extent do they struggle because the brand building portion of the go-to-market has atrophied from their core competencies? Does that make sense?
Yep. That's definitely a contributing factor, right? And you think about it, the people that have, let's take an example, Wendy's 7,000-ish restaurants in the US. Nobody is there that was part of building the brand to 7,000 restaurants or 6,000, whatever the number is in the US. For the most part, the majority of that growth happened in the 90s and the 80s. So in that brand building kind of tactical battle that happened when they grew all that, nobody's there. And so you do have people and you hire that expertise for brand builders, but that can be a challenge, especially with a brand that gets a little bit lost into how they got there. Another way to say that, and this is the way that I like to think about it, is US brands, when they go internationally, one of the big problems they have and the mistakes they can make is they mistake the essence for the brand for the application of the brand. For example, in the US, again, if we're using a Wendy's or something, the brand stands for equality as a core principle, core essence, right? When you map it all out. So quality is what we need to communicate. And in the US, fresh, never frozen beef would be the quality message that is sent. That's the application. Now, when you start going internationally, you could make the mistake of saying, we're going to copy paste that approach and say in Indonesia, fresh, never frozen beef is our core quality message. The cold chain is such in Indonesia, especially for meat, where if you try to do fresh beef, you're going to make a lot of people sick. So that quality message won't come across. In fact, it would be terrible. Not only would it not come across, to be extremely damaging, right? And that can be replicated in a lot of ways. And that comes down to the fact that people forget it's easier to understand the application and just say copy paste. In the US, it's harder to understand the core essence of what your brand is, especially if it's a, QSR, food and beverage brand. What do you stand for in the consumer's mind? And if you never really did that exercise, or you didn't go through the rigor of keeping that at the center of what you did, people come in and might just think the application is what the brand is. And that's, as a marketer, you would know that's not the case. That's
an interesting insight. And it seems to me that there would be a distinction between brands that have within their core essence enough of these potential permutations to essentially facilitate like a good go-to-market in these international. I just want to ask you directly now, because I'm curious. If I'm Wendy's going into Indonesia, what's the permutation? How do you permutate that core essence into an appropriate
So, for example, the
application?
number one product that sells in Indonesia, and this isn't true for Wendy's, this is almost true for anybody that does QSR, is fried chicken and rice. Bone-in chicken
Yeah.
and rice. Like, you have to sell it.
So-
Otherwise, nobody's coming to your restaurant. The average Indonesian eats 4 pounds of beef a year. The average American eats 7 pounds of beef a week.
Yeah.
So the product, the actual offering has to change.
Yeah.
So then that really forces you to think about, okay, fresh, never frozen beef obviously isn't my quality measure. Square hamburger really can't be what my brand stands for. Those are all applications.
Yeah.
How does my brand fit as a bone-in chicken brand with rice? Like, those are things that, and again, from an international standpoint, it forced me to realize the brand isn't necessarily about the food. It's about the messaging. It's about your connection to the consumer. It's about what you're communicating with the food. The food and the application can take different forms.
Yep.
Now, obviously, that is probably on the spectrum, right? Indonesia would be very far from the US consumer. And so the application of the brand from the core essence would look very different.
Yep.
You could expect that. You wouldn't want to, again, have a dramatically differentiating proposition for something that's maybe as close to the US market as the UK or Europe or Australia. In those instances, you'll get something that mirrors a little bit closer. But sometimes those can be even more problematic because they're just similar enough that they make you think they're the same.
Yeah.
And then from an execution standpoint, you start operating like it's a US market and you start marketing like it's a US market. And there's obviously dramatic differences in marketing in the UK and Australia in their sense of humor and how so those things can definitely have a factor.
That makes sense. To what extent do brands, I guess these franchising brands, to what extent do these brands, let me share a story with you, give you a little bit of context,
Okay.
and then I'll ask the question. I was speaking with a brand management professional he worked at Southwest Airlines, and they were talking about their expansion to the Hawaiian market, where previously they'd have no flight routes there, and they were expanding to that area of the world. They talked a lot about essentially contouring their brand messaging for those markets. And part of their go-to-market strategy there was to partner with Hawaiian influencers, Hawaiian celebrities, Hawaiian folks who had really had their finger on the pulse of the Hawaiian culture to help deliver the core tenets of their brand messaging. And apologies to Southwest, apologies to this particular brand manager professional. I can't recall those brand ideas to the forefront of my mind right now. But that really stuck with me. And so it makes me think about, you just shared with us that, and I totally agree with you, the brand is not necessarily the product. When you get to that certain level, when the model becomes franchise, your brand at that point is very clearly its own entity and its own territory. Which, by the way, I think there are so many businesses where their current, particularly with small businesses, where it's like your marketing and your branding can't outrun like a bad product in the tech space. Sometimes it can't even overrun like a fairly standard offering, right? The product really has to be exceptional to get the brand under it, so on and so forth. And what you've shared with me in the food space, you're totally right. These brands have built themselves around, whether it's consistency or quality, there's these different messages that are wrapped up there. But I'm digressing. The point is the brand is its own separate thing.
It's interesting too, and not to contradict myself, but you're right. The brand isn't necessarily the product.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a unique aspect of, in fact, I can't think of very many other industries that have the same thing.
Yeah.
But there's a unique aspect within F&B, especially these big F&B brands, where you have brands within a brand, right? So, for example, with McDonald's, you have the McDonald's brand,
Yep.
and then you have the Big Mac, or you have
The Happy Meal.
you have the Happy Meal, and you have Wendy's, and you have Frosty, or you have the Baconator, you have Dairy Queen, and you have Blizzard.
Yeah.
In some instances, the brand isn't the product, but these brands have brands, and it's relatively unique, right? If you think at other companies that have brands, Nabisco itself isn't necessarily a brand.
Yep.
They obviously own brands.
Yep.
But these you have within the F&B space that are very powerful.
Yeah.
And that play a big deal with some of the partnerships, because then you're partnering with
Yeah.
You're a brand that has a brand that's
Yep.
going to partner with another brand.
Yep.
That can be really powerful as well. So it is somewhat unique, I think, to the space. And
Yeah.
I can't think of many examples just off the cuff of things that mimic that kind
Yeah.
of inception type of idea, dream within a dream.
Yeah, it's like you've got the branded house that is also a house of brands, right? Which is that's
And some of them are more powerful than others, right? You just
Definitely.
have these ones that stick, right? And F&B brands are trying to create concepts in food all the time that have that staying power. And sometimes, most times, it happens organically. They didn't, if they tried to do it, they couldn't replicate it. And again, that's where you get Baconator and Blizzard and Big Mac and all these different things. But generally, it happens organically.
Yeah, I love that. The Baconator is one of my favorite. Well, so hold on, let me clarify. I haven't eaten a lot of Baconators in my life, but as far as
that's good because you're still alive, right? Your heart needs it.
I couldn't take too many of them. But what a stroke of genius from creating a brand within a brand. And I don't remember the exact year that came out, but there was probably like a solid decade, at least maybe 15 years, where the internet culture was all about bacon this, bacon that, put more bacon on everything, right? Kind of the epic meal times of the world were going on. And here's the Baconator that's all about bacon. I think that is...
It causes some problems for me as somebody that used to work with Wendy's. Baconator, you're right, that bacon's in everything with Wendy's. So it's one of the brand strengths. And then I go to the Middle East in the GCC and we're opening Wendy's and you can't use Baconator.
Yeah.
And that's bacon is not halal. That doesn't work. And so you can't even use the name Baconator. You can use Ader, Cheeseinator, or different things. And there's some brand value, but probably more brand dilution that comes with doing stuff like that from a tactical standpoint. But yeah, it can cause some problems because that's just a part of the world where you have a higher hill to climb to try to get over that issue where you didn't have that tool in your toolbox where you do in other parts of the world.
Sure. And I asked the question earlier about brand building atrophying as a core competency, but I'm refining my thinking here. And maybe it's just a case where some of the muscles required to build brands in those markets, in a lot of cases, just never existed. Right.
Never existed. And it's one of the challenges with franchisees, international franchisees, because generally they don't have a lot of experience in brand building. That's why you would want to be a franchisee.
Yep.
Otherwise, you just go do your own. And it is something that I think is important with having somebody with international experience when they're taking specifically commercial brands or supporting you, even if they're not directly affiliated with it. That's one of the hallmarks of an international businessman is that will be part of your core competency.
Yep.
Because you have to constantly be thinking about it. And it's something that if you're a domestic business person, you generally aren't thinking about.
Yeah.
Because you're a steward of a brand or you're managing something, you're not necessarily brand building. And so it is one of the hallmarks of somebody that has international experience. And it's also one of the reasons it's important to hire for international experience when you're taking something internationally or you're doing a project that's going to start to expand. Groups make the mistake of using that as maybe a growth opportunity for people. And there always should be growth opportunities. But when you just take a group of US professionals and say, you're going to go launch Japan for me, and now we'll give you a different title, that's going to be a disaster.
It's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
No, you know what it reminds me of? I started my marketing career in the video game space. And what it reminds me of is, and I got a question. Let me share this story real quick, and I got a follow-up question for you. But it reminds me of, there was a period of time where every Western video game company in the world wanted to get into China, right? Because it's this massive consumer audience, this big sleeping dragon. If we can just get our product into China, we'll make hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And no one anticipates stolen IP or the Great Wall, the Great Firewall, how difficult it is. The Chinese government will sometimes selectively let products into that market just so they can copy them and then kick them out later. And it's this really, truly difficult go-to-market problem there. And every now and then you'll see a developer get really every now and then. That's a cyclical conversation. It comes and it goes. And just recently, there was a video game that came out of China that sold so many units called Black Myth Wukong.
Yeah, it's kicking my butt.
See,
It's so hard.
I still get, and it's obviously sold so many copies. There's been a couple of Western video game releases that have really underperformed or cost the publishers, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. And so I read on discussion forums, and the casual consumers going, why did they just do what Black Myth Wukong? Why doesn't everyone go for the Chinese market? And I think it's a flavor of what you're expressing, where I think, here's my question. Is it your perception that sometimes brands will just simply underestimate the difficulty, effort required, time, resources involved in a good go-to-market approach for their non-home market?
Yeah, 100% yes. 100% yes. And in international commercialization speak, what we would classify as high context, low context markets.
Sure.
So low context being the markets that are maybe the most similar in terms of the consumer base, the regulatory system, what you need to understand, your likelihood to be successful if you were to operate whatever business model you were doing yourself in a market. High context being the most different compared to your home culture, base, language, regulatory system, nuance, like all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So China, obviously, very high context market.
Yeah.
So if your strategy, as part of your go-to-market strategy, was approaching a high context market with a low context game plan, you're in for a wake-up call. Yeah, it's going to be fun. Generally, at least from my experience, specifically with F&B, is like having great local partners in the high context markets like China, like Japan, is the recipe for success.
Sure.
Because you can bring in your expertise as to what worked and what you're looking for and what your business model is going to be and the vision for the brand, etc. And then you have local partners that keep you in check and be like, did you think about this? Do you realize this? This is different for here. And to some aspect, everybody thinks their market is different and special, but that's how you differentiate the low context to the high context. And making sure that's ranked and you understand what you're going into can be really impactful. So part of the reason why Dairy Queen is successful in China is we have some really great partners, and they understand the market, they understand the regulatory system, they understand the go-to-market strategies, and we understand the brand, and they help us apply the brand. And so those partnerships work really well. And franchising, I think in general, as long as it's done in your place as a brand steward and where you can add value, that's really a strength.
Yeah.
And you're not having to do it yourself.
Yep.
So you can outsource, quote unquote, some of that to a great partner that can do it better. And really, that's a huge factor in considering. Some people talk about, why aren't you just doing it yourself when you're going to some of these places? Chipotle doesn't franchise anything.
Really?
100% owned. The first franchise unit, and I had a conversation with Chipotle when I was in the Middle East with Shatranj Capital Partners. The first franchise unit that they've ever done is in Kuwait. And the reason that is because that's a high context market, high context part of the world. And what they should have done, and I believe what they did, is they looked at it and said, listen, we can't operate these better than a local partner can with our support. And that would deliver a better product. Everywhere else, they've obviously felt like they could operate it better, even in Europe. Debatable, but that's what they felt. The Middle East is probably the first place where they've said, local partner can do it. We can be a stronger presence. That's one of the factors that you would consider in when you begin your franchise journey. Can somebody else do it better with your support?
Yep. That makes sense. I didn't know that about Chipotle. That makes a lot of sense. Who does Dr. Brandon Guthrie admire as far as, if there's a brand that leverages partnerships for international expansion really well, who do you want to be when you grow up in that space? Who do you admire in that space who's just masters at using partnerships to enter into international markets?
F&B or otherwise?
F&B and otherwise.
I'll leave Dairy Queen off the table, so I won't be biased, but I do think they do a great job, obviously.
Well, If you want to talk about it, I'd love to hear about it. But
So I'll riff on that a little bit. I think one of the things that's really interesting, and it's not exactly answering your question, but like specifically with food, you have different versions of partnerships. Sometimes we view those partnerships as more of a commodity. So like, for example, like a food commodity. So for example, Oreo.
Yeah.
Oreo is a brand.
Yep.
But it's such a prevalent brand, even internationally, that it's almost viewed more as a commodity. But that's also where you get some of the most amazing partnerships. One of the products for Dairy Queen that does the best is obviously Oreo Blizzard.
Yep.
Now, what's strong there is those are two brands. Like Oreo Blizzard is two brands in the same word.
Yep.
Right? In the same title. And that's obviously a super powerful. So the one of the, maybe let's call it the low-hanging fruit for some of those partnerships is how you integrate some of those food brands into your existing products.
Yeah.
That's very natural, almost seamless, where the consumer might not even realize it's a partnership. They're just like, oh, I just want that. That's when it's like, oh, this is great. When it's more obvious that it's a partnership, then it kind of enters, I think, into a different realm of, that's when you get into more, let's call it the Happy Meal space, where it's, okay, we're bringing in this new movie or this new toy, and that's why people are going to come in, and that's why the kids are going to try our food. Nobody can replicate McDonald's in terms of Happy Meal. They just execute that so well internationally. They're always very relevant with a lot of their Happy Meal offerings. They're with the latest movie or with the latest toy. They have such, and they're doing it so well everywhere with the scale. They can get some amazing supply chain and economics as part of their considerations when they're doing some of these partnerships. So probably McDonald's in terms of the straight partnership. Now, when you're entering a new market, that's a little different, right? So that's all maybe just regular day-to-day execution of just growing. If you're entering a new market, it gets a little interesting because, for example, when we entered Japan, we were the challenger brand. So you go from the US, where you're the behemoth, everybody knows who you are, to a new market where nobody knows who you are. And so sometimes I think with brand partnerships, you kind of change seats on the plane, where now instead of the front, you're at the back, and you're hoping to build awareness and build presence as a challenger brand, when in the home market, you're doing the opposite. You're evaluating people who are just going to only add value to what you're going to do, and you can be very selective. Yeah. So it was a bit humbling, difficult to be in that situation.
Was this with Wendy's?
Yeah, when Wendy's entered Japan, I was a big part of that project, and they still do it. That took some explaining to people in the US as well. It's like, why would we be doing these partnerships?
Yep.
Like, we're a big brand. And we're a big brand in the US.
Yeah.
Like, we're working on it in Japan.
Yeah.
When we're doing a video game partnership or we're doing something, it would materially drive sales. And the idea there is you're getting trial. But if you were to do that same idea in the US, you could do that, but you'd probably be diluting your brand and what your brand stands for. And so you wouldn't do that in the US. So there is applications, I think, for some of these big brands with the partnerships. And there is a bit like that challenger brand mentality. Brand partnerships can be very useful. And it's one avenue where you can gain access to consumer share of mind. You can give people a reason to try your restaurant other than just the name of your brand. You're leveraging somebody else's.
Yep.
And that consumer's like, oh, I trust this brand. Or there's an offering here that's motivating me, so I'm going to go try this new brand that I haven't had before called Wendy's or whatever it's going to be. And it can be a very effective tool in commercializing new markets and building that awareness. And eventually, though, you don't want it to become a drug where that's all you're doing and you're just known for rapid partnerships because you've never really built you have to build a brand. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just you're always a parasite living off of other brands. That doesn't work.
Yep. It starts to get a little imbalanced as to what you can offer others. You know what it reminds me of when you're unpacking that answer for me? Let me share a thought, and then I got a question. Some brand partnerships that got on my radar a couple of years ago that I thought were particularly well executed. McDonald's had the run of like celebrity meals. I think they still do. Maybe they cooled off on them a little bit. And I think one or two other brands dipped their foot into that pool. But for example, I know they had one with J Ball and they had one with BTS. And those are examples of celebrities that are just beloved in particular markets. And to me, it seems like that aligns a little bit with what you're saying
Yeah.
about the go-to-market and trying to grow market share in some of those markets. My question to you, with that context, if you are a corporate brand, a household name brand, and you're thinking about your marketing strategy in these various markets, I would just love to hear you discuss what are some of the practical signals that you're looking at, that you're interpreting, that you're digesting to determine whether or not we want to partner up with someone to execute some kind of brand partnership to grow share of mind versus just saying we're big enough and we can do it. What are you really looking at? What are the kind of the hair triggers that lead you one way or another?
I don't know if you're ever big enough to avoid a brand partnership. The biggest brands do them the most.
Yeah.
Household names. So there's obviously always going to be a potential application. So we'll start with that.
Yeah.
I think, but how you evaluate the value that's going to come from a partnership is different depending on kind of the position that you're in.
Sure.
So if you are some of those major household name brands and you're evaluating, and really you're a steward of a brand, right? And step one is do no harm. Any partnership that you're going to evaluate, you have to have very low risk tolerance to something that can be relatively incremental to drive your business, right? Budweiser probably made that mistake a little bit. And so those are some of the things that you have to evaluate is step one, do no harm, right? If we're talking in an investment lingo, which is near and dear to my heart, right? You go from wealth creation to wealth preservation. You're in preservation mode. You're not, the incremental gains that you can do for something can be, it's important, but you have to make sure that you're at least keeping what you have. Don't lose ground. That's a big filter for the big brands, right?
Absolutely.
So that's going to screen out a whole lot of stuff.
Yep.
But then the rest, I think, gets a little bit easier when you're just saying, okay, what is the value? What's it going to do? And then it's a little bit of a numbers game and what you think. I mentioned some of sometimes the celebrity endorsements and the celebrity partnerships like with BTS, they internationally specifically, they mean different things in different markets. Some consumers are basically looking for that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go somewhere unless my favorite K-pop band endorses it. And so there's a section of consumers that you're never going to get unless you do that partnership. Yeah. And they'll basically just migrate from brand to brand depending on who's being endorsed. And so that can be important. But I think that's probably the easiest one. The lowest hanging fruit is when you're a big brand, do no harm. If you're in a challenger mode, you have a much higher risk tolerance. You can't do harm to the home brand, but in the home market, you have some liberty to try some things and see what sticks. And ultimately, like I said, you're trying to drive trial. You just want somebody to have a reason to experience your food or your product. Yep. And now that partnership's done its job, right? They got in the door. Do you have an offering that resonates with them to come back? And I think that's where you can get into this. You don't want to be something that just lives off of only partnerships. You have to also be strong enough as a home brand to give people a reason to come back. And I think then that drives additional potential partnership opportunities because new doors will unlock and new groups or larger groups will want to partner with you because your brand is stronger. So I think as a brand builder, you have to use it as a tool, but you can't take your eye off the ball of building your own brand or managing your own brand. And I think that's the balance I think that happens.
Got to meet the minimum threshold of brand and product strength to actually convert those customers and make them part of your camp. That makes sense. Here's a question, piggybacking on your thought about do no harm being a powerful filter, especially for large brands. My perception is there's a number of brands that have just completely solved the awareness problem. Find me someone who's above the age of 6 who doesn't know what McDonald's is, right? I'd put Wendy's, I'd put Dairy Queen has huge awareness. Any one of those QSR brands, Taco Bell, all of those, they've largely solved the awareness problem, particularly in their home markets. And my perception is, I'm going to go back to the McDonald's brand partnerships. My perception is that part of what McDonald's was going for in some of those brand partnerships, they weren't solving an awareness problem. They were trying to solve a relevancy problem. How do we, at BTS, same thing, right? It's like, how do we make our product that, for at least our purposes, the product is good enough to convert to to allow us to retain customers from these various partnership ventures. But they're solving a relevancy problem. We need to become more relevant with these target audiences.
Yep.
And so my question is, how do you reconcile for these larger brands, if you're trying to chase relevancy and become more relevant to consumers, how do you reconcile that with sometimes the thing that's most relevant is not necessarily super palatable to your brand? And I'll give you an example. Travis Scott, his meal, the Cactus Jack meal that they did a couple years ago, it was like single-handedly responsible for reversing the sales trends for McDonald's, over a particular quarter or two. But then the whole Astroworld thing happened and people died at a concert, and it's like overnight his brand materially changed. And it's like, how do you reconcile wanting to be hyper relevant and always be in the conversation with the next new thing when maybe the next new thing is eating Tide Pods or something that is really...
Don't do that.
Do you understand what I'm asking? How does a large brand...
This has been part 1 of a 2-part episode of the Brand Together podcast. Join us again next week for part 2, along with more brand partnership insights. And remember to subscribe to the Brand Together podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or anywhere else podcasts are found.